Hello and welcome to this edition of Global Voices of Accessible Travel. I am your host, Laurent, the co-founder of Tapus Travel. We are an inclusive travel company based in the San Francisco Bay Area of California. We specialize in organizing trips for our guests, their families, and friends across the US, Canada, and selected destinations worldwide. Today we're going back to Australia. Specifically, we're going to the state of Victoria at the very southeast corner of the continent in order to speak with our friend and colleague Martin Heng. Martin is a well-known figure in the world of travel, let alone accessible travel. He worked at Lonely Planet for over 20 years, including 7 years as the editorial manager. And following a road accident that left him a quadriplegic, he became the Lonely Planet Accessible Travel Manager and Editorial Advisor. In this role, Martin published a number of accessible travel titles, including the trailblazing Accessible Travel online resources and the Accessible Travel Phrasebook, both widely used today by travel professionals and individual travelers alike. Martin is a sought-after speaker at travel conferences around the world and is one of the most preeminent voices educating and advocating for the global communities of people with disabilities. In Australia, Martin is at the forefront of the inclusiveness movement, both through his chairmanship of the IDEAS organization and, most importantly, as his role as a member of the State of Victoria Disability Advisory Council. Martin is also a founding member of SPIRE, the Spinal Cord Injury Network of Professionals, and with all these activities, it is a miracle that Martin still finds the time to travel all over the world. So, without further ado, let's go and meet Martin.
Hello, Martin. How are you?
I'm good. Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Good morning. It's late afternoon in California. It's mid-morning in Australia.
And it's spring is coming. The leaves are out and the blossoms are out. It's beautiful.
We are just the opposite. It's the start of the fall officially, actually. Oh my God, September 20. It's the first day of fall. So, just the reverse. For the people that have the misfortune of not knowing you yet, can you just take a few seconds to introduce yourself, tell us where you are and what's going on in your part of the world?
Well, I'm as we've just said, I'm in Australia. We just start of spring. I am a wheelchair user. I've used a wheelchair. I had a spinal cord injury almost exactly 10 years ago, and I've been a wheelchair user since then, quadriplegic, incomplete quadriplegic. So I'm very lucky to have retained a reasonable amount of function for a quadriplegic. I worked for just over, almost exactly 21 years for Lonely Planet.
Wow.
Until just recently. And obviously I'm one of the COVID casualties. With Lonely Planet in May deciding to close its offices in Melbourne and London, making, I guess, probably close to 200 people redundant, I would say, at least 150. 100 people here in Melbourne. Melbourne was, for a long time, Lonely Planet's home and its headquarters. And then a few years ago, it was sold. The operations moved to London a little bit when the BBC owned Lonely Planet, and then Brad Kelly is a venture capitalist in the US. He bought Lonely Planet about 8 years ago, and then kind of some functions went to Nashville in Tennessee, or close to Nashville, yeah, slowly, I think, although operations continued in Melbourne, Melbourne was no longer the hub. But nonetheless, the main production facilities were still here. And we had 100 people here until May, and then COVID hit, and very, very quickly, Lonely Planet decided to close its offices. It wasn't really a surprise to me because Lonely Planet obviously has been struggling for I guess, increasingly so over the last 10 to 15 years. Lonely Planet was garnering a bigger and bigger share of a smaller and smaller guidebook market. Basically, I don't think Lonely Planet ever really cracked the digital age. We had a great opportunity. We were ahead of the game when I joined the company in 1999. We had a very large online community, but never managed to capitalize on that. And so, although in recent years we were indisputably the world's global largest guidebook publisher, the market was getting smaller and smaller because people basically don't want to pay for information these days. And people were using books less and less. So even though Lonely Planet was the major player, the market was getting smaller and smaller, and there would eventually have come a tipping point when the market would no longer sustain even a single major player for very long. So COVID really just was the last nail in the coffin, and I don't actually know what's happened since we left the company because the communications haven't been fantastic. But it wasn't much of a surprise that they decided to kind of cut operations pretty quickly. Since then, I've been quite busy doing this and that, not necessarily travel related. I've written a few articles, but I've also, at the end of last year, I was elected, or appointed rather, to the Victorian Disability Advisory Council, which is a 3-year appointment, and we're advising the Victorian government on disability policy, and we meet once every couple of months. And of course, because of COVID, we've had extra sessions about accessible communications to the disability communities. So that's keeping me a little bit busy. And that's been very interesting work. I think over the last 2 years, because of the way Lonely Planet has been going, and because of where my interests lie, I have actually been thinking of moving away from travel and into more mainstream disability work. I've been the chairperson of a disability organization in Australia for 3-4 years. Ideas is a fantastic organization. Oh, yeah, basically, we provide free information to assist people to lead more independent lives. And since COVID hit, Ideas was asked by the federal government to staff a COVID disability helpline, and we've been doing that for the last 3 or 4 months. And of course, been getting quite a lot of. We're open 8 till 8, and we get a lot of calls. So yeah, that's been keeping me busy as well. A lot of irons in the fire.
That sounds great. You know, I'm so impressed. You know, after 21 years at Lonely Planet, where again you were at the forefront of the publishing of a number of accessible travel guide, the accessible travel phrase guidebook. I mean, a number of tools that I'm using. And you know, and shamelessly, I advise all our travelers to go and see if you can find a copy. I think you can still download a PDF. I hope you can still download a PDF, because
I think you can. The question is where to from here, because although of course Lonely Planet has the copyright to that my online accessible travel online resources, sure. I still have the database, and the question is, will I and should I update that, and in what way I should do that, because I think it is an amazing resource with literally hundreds and hundreds of websites that I've tracked down and assessed.
Sure, absolutely.
And I have another probably 200 entries that I can add for the next edition. So if I do produce another edition, which is possible, I think I'd have a real think about the format and what I'd need to put in that to make it not only more useful for users, but also perhaps to shift away from what it was before, because Lonely Planet had a policy, a very good policy of carrying no advertising, because it maintained editorial independence. Now, if I were to produce a next edition of Accessible Travel Online Resources, I would probably be looking at a different Lonely Planet and didn't take advertising. I never included sponsored organizations in that publication. But if I continue to produce this publication, I would look at a different format and maybe approach people and see if they would be interested in having a more kind of more coverage with photographs and more detailed coverage of individual venues and individual businesses.
Absolutely, and I will tell you that I wish, I wish you luck, and if there is anything we can do on our end to support you in that effort, because this is an incredible tool that you have produced. I'm talking about the Russell's Guide. I'm talking also about the travel phrases guides that you produce, which again, for people coming to the US. From France, for example, I make sure that I give them or direct them to a copy of that so they can learn, the terms of lingo. It's those incredible tools, and hopefully they won't go. But this is something that you can keep and continue with that. I'm fascinated by the fact that the state of Victoria has created a position, a space for somebody like you to advise them and to be the advocate of accessibility, and it's amazing. And obviously I wish there were a lot of countries that will do so, but it seems from where we are in the US, I don't want to get where I am politically and the misery of being here right now, but looking at other countries and the way they approach not just COVID, the pandemic, but issues of accessibility and disability, right? It's, can you give some perspective on that? Because I think our viewers here in the US will be really interested in knowing how other countries are approaching this.
I'm sorry, Laurent, you broke up a little bit. You're breaking up a little bit there, so you'll have to repeat that question.
Absolutely. If you could touch a little bit on your work with the state of Victoria and the way they have created this place, this position, and what do they expect? Are we talking on kind of just philosophical discussions, or are they looking to really take advice and implement programs that will go directly towards the quality of life of people with disabilities?
I think the latter. I'm very lucky to live in Victoria. Victoria is actually one of the more progressive states in Australia. We have a very similar system to the US. We have a federal system where the states have a lot of autonomy in certain respects, and then the federal government has control in others, national borders and defense, for example. But Victoria is very progressive compared to other states in terms of its support for disability. For example, well, we had this groundbreaking introduction of a national disability insurance scheme several years ago, and that has really revolutionized people's attitudes, but also the opportunities for many disabled people. What many people don't realize is that the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or NDIS, will only cover about 10% of the disabled population in Australia for various reasons. One of the main reasons being people over 65 are excluded automatically because they are covered by, I guess, the aged care schemes. But it does disadvantage a lot of people. But the thing is, the introduction of the scheme has made people think that, oh, well, disabled people are looked after now. We don't need to worry about them anymore. And it's also enabled the states, which used to fund disability organizations from their coffers, it's enabled them to pull back and say, oh, well, we have the National Disability Insurance Scheme now. The federal government and the NDIS is going to look after that. And they've actually stopped funding a lot of organizations, including ideas. What the NDIS has done has actually disadvantaged a lot of disability organizations, whether they're peak organizations representing individual conditions such as spinal cord injury or scleroderma or many of the other deafness. And it's made it very hard for them to access funding. And that includes ideas. And it's been very easy for the states and the federal government to play each other off against each other. Say, oh, this is a state issue. Oh, this is a federal issue. And so so, you know, funding has fallen through the cracks. Now, for example, then New South Wales has stopped funding advocacy for disability organisations, whereas Victoria, which is much more progressive, has continued to fund advocacy for disability organisations. And in fact, I've just been helping to assist an additional $650,000 that's been allocated for advocacy just for COVID-related issues for disability organisations in Victoria. That's not happening elsewhere in Australia. So we're very lucky in Australia to have this kind of progressive, liberal-minded Labor government. So in Victoria, by law, the state government has to have a rolling 4-year disability action plan, and that's coming to the end this year. So it also by law has to have what's the Victorian Disability Advisory Council, of which I'm a member, and there are 12 other members. And the Victorian Disability Advisory Council advises state government on the action plan, the state disability plan. And we help to assess, so this current VDAC, as it's called, we're helping to assess the effectiveness of the plan that's outgoing, that's finishing in 2020. And we're going to help frame the next plan, which is going to be in operation for the next 4 years. So it's a very important appointment to the council right now, because we have this plan which will affect, you know, Victorians for the next 4 years, effectively. In the meantime, you know, we get direct access to the Minister for Disability in Victoria. Every meeting we have every couple of months, he attends the meeting. So we have direct access to the Minister, which is very unusual, actually, to be able to talk to a minister from a government. So I feel very privileged to be in this situation, and also to be able, in the times of COVID, to be able to assist people with disability to cope in various different ways, whether it's developing accessible communications that are making sure that people with disability are not left out of communications, whether they have deafness or hard of hearing, or whether they have acquired brain injury, whatever their access issue might be. There's an accessible communications reference group that's convened just to make sure that we're reaching these hard to reach cohorts.
I understand. Well, that's really impressive. So so you're finishing the 4-year plan, and you can already point to actual physical manifestation of that plan in the real life. Whether creating some communication tools that somebody can acquire and use, or
the communications reference group was put together just recently as a result of COVID to make sure that announcements and public health announcements and developments will be able to be communicated to the different groups that had different access requirements.
Sure.
But the good thing is that now we've created these channel plans, so we know how to communicate to these different groups. We can use the same channel plan to communicate other things to those groups throughout normal daily life, not just in the times of COVID.
Right. It's on the same issue, but I'm going a little bit on the tangent, because I also want to relate to those articles that you wrote recently, and moving beyond accessibility into inclusiveness. And I've noticed I've been using a white paper from Amadeus recently on another project that we're involved with, and I've noticed that you are listed as one of the contributors
That's right.
to that. So I'd like to touch on, again, moving beyond accessibility into inclusiveness, but also going back to the issue of how do we convince not just the state government, how do we convince the business community, the hospitality industry, and so on and so forth, that inclusiveness can be translated into hard dollars, especially what the whole industry is suffering today. And hopefully we will all have another ace in our deck of cards saying we can actually be part of the renewal of the tourism industry once we are past the COVID, because inclusiveness and accessibility / inclusiveness can be translated into hard solution and business solution for the hurting tourism industry.
Oh, look, I think it's been, there's been talk about the green recovery, and I think that, the fact that we can use this opportunity to really look at the direction in which we're traveling and use it to kind of actually shift direction, change direction. And we've talked about it, and so we've heard about people talk about the green revolution or the green recovery. And I think the same could be said about travel and about accessibility in travel, or kind of universal access in travel. And we could use this as an opportunity to reset. Now, talking about inclusivity as opposed to accessibility is by no means new. You are well aware of our very good friend Scott Rains was talking about inclusive travel. That was his preferred term, 10 to 15 years ago. And he was fond of saying, I think something along the lines of, why ask whether something should be accessible? What makes it so special that it shouldn't be inclusive? Why shouldn't everybody have the opportunity to be able to access it? The world's leading academic in the field, Simon Darcy, who's working here out of the University of Technology in Sydney. Again, he's been talking about inclusive rather than accessible travel since at least 2009. This is not a new concept. And the way both Scott Rains and Simon Darcy talk about inclusiveness as opposed to accessibility is to look at it in terms of a whole of life approach. It's called a whole of life approach. So we don't look at people's impairments and say, look, we need to look at these impairments and make sure that these impairments are catered for by making things accessible. What we need to do is consider that we're looking at the whole of the population from cradle to grave. And young children up to the age of 10 to 15, and older people from the age of 60, 70 onwards are not going to be as functionally able as the people in between. So we're talking about a whole of life. And those in between people, at different points of their life, their functionality will also fluctuate depending on their health, depending on whether they're injured, depending on several other factors. So what we're thinking about is actually catering whatever business you're in. What you need to do is expand your potential customer base. So if you design a product and then you have to tweak and alter that product to make it suitable for a different demographic, then you've done the wrong thing. You need to really think about, and people and businesses do this as a matter of course. When they're designing a product, they think about, how can I design my product to make it as widely applicable to as many people as possible so that I can have the biggest market possible. And exactly the same is true in tourism. You design your tourism product so you have the widest possible market, and you do it from the beginning when you're first designing it, rather than trying to retrofit, because retrofitting anything, whether it's software or whether it's a tourism product, is always going to be more expensive, and you're never going to get as good a result as if you design with universal design principles in mind from the very beginning. And universal design has become a little bit of a buzzword, which is great. When you're talking about whether it's tourism or whether you're talking about urban design and urban town planning, because universal design is this same idea. It's the whole of life approach. You design a product or a service or a facility to make sure that it's usable by the maximum number of people, no matter what their functional ability. So I'm really happy that this idea of universal design is beginning to take off, and it's also beginning to take hold within the tourism industry, I think. And that's been my mission over the last 2 or 3 years, is to bring the discussion about accessible tourism around to universal design principles, and to use people like Simon Darcy to say, look, there's academic research that's been done over the last 15 to 20 years that backs this up. It's not just me saying, you know, let's make sure everyone's included. It's actually makes business sense, and there's been an awful lot of studies about this done already.
Right, right. No, I couldn't agree more. We, as you mentioned, we both knew Scott, and at least in the way I talk about my company, what we do, tourism, travel, I am finding myself more and more moving away from accessibility or accessible travel and more into inclusive travel. It's been true from the very beginning. But the motto of our company is making travel for people of all abilities, our friends and families, not trying again to give this idea, an ideal of inclusiveness. But the conversation that we have, I mean, we are in this echo chamber of people that this is our world, this is our community, our industry. So we know what we talk about. I find myself having more difficulties trying to convey the essence of that concept to people that are not part of our community, they're not integral part, or not out of meanness, just maybe out of ignorance, or just we're still using terms and words and ideas and concepts that are by now, they've been used, that's it, we can definitely move beyond them. And the conversation is also on a daily basis. A lot of preconceived ideas and a lot of people in the industry, even with a desire to be part of this, because they see, as you said, they see the actual business value to enlarge a customer base and redesign a product. Even when you have conversations with those people, because there is maybe too many words that mean the same but not exactly, so some people will just go to the easy solution of saying, oh, it's for the disabled, or yeah, I'll make it accessible. And we need to have a way, a little bit like your phrase book. We need to have kind of understanding across the board, across nation, globally, about some terms that we are now adopting as the one to move forward. Not because it's a catchword, it's a sexy word to use, because it truly represents the new concept, the new idea, maybe not new, but something that we want everybody to understand and to get involved in making it workable. So inclusiveness is definitely one of those words. I'm going to smile, just opening a parenthesis, but we went to India fairly recently to examine the state of the Indian hospitality industry in terms of accessibility and so forth. And I remember being in one of those super high luxury hotel in Mumbai, a beautiful place, and they did have a couple out of 100 rooms in a big hotel that were accessible, and they were nicely designed and everything. And our conversation with the hotel manager, and they were extremely proud, by the way, of having made those rooms accessible, but it was almost kind of hospital accessibility, where the sink will go up and down, the toilet will move forward and backward. I mean, all the gimmicks and all the gizmos to make it accessible, quote unquote, to a very specific segment of our community, because in their mind, accessibility meant only a person in a wheelchair. And then I
Yes,
said,
yes,
and then I
this is a
said,
real problem.
yeah, and again, not out of meanness, just because that's the way they've been trained or used to think about what accessibility means. The accessibility equals disability or person with disability. And then I said, um, can you tell me how a pregnant woman could use your room and your bathroom when she comes? She's pregnant and maybe she also has a small child with her. Impossible. That
Yeah.
room, a pregnant woman will not be able to use it. And I say, okay, so this is what I'm talking about, And again, I don't want to preach to the convert here, but it goes beyond just using the right word. It goes beyond some, advocacy or making sure that everybody we talk to, interact with, do business with. We can establish a baseline of understanding of words and concepts. So,
Well, one of the things
that's a struggle. It's not over yet.
it's a change in attitude, but also a change in perception. And one of the things that I've picked up on and focused on in my recent talks around the world is the international symbol for disability, which is the wheelchair, which is the wheelchair. Now, my take on that is the only thing that has going for it is the fact that it is universally recognized. Everybody recognizes what it stands for. But on the other hand, what that has done is shifted people's perceptions. So now when people think of disability, they think of someone in a wheelchair.
Exactly.
Whereas in fact, by all academic studies, wheelchair users are well under 10% of the disabled population. Between probably 6 and 8% by most counts of the disabled population. And yet, when they think of disability, they think of people in wheelchairs. There may be 25% of people who are disabled who have some sort of in wheelchair, 6%. So if you make something accessible for wheelchair users, you're only making it accessible for 6 to 8% of the disabled population. And that's actually not very helpful.
No.
And as you say, you're not just ignoring people, you're not just ignoring people who are deaf or who are blind or have other disabilities. You're also ignoring people who are pregnant, who might be with children, who might be using prams or strollers. You're also ignoring seniors who have other issues. If you focus on wheelchairs, then you're also thinking about accommodations that might be very costly. Whereas you can make a lot of very, very small changes that are cost-free or almost cost-free that are going to benefit other members of the population who have access issues other than being in a wheelchair. How much does it cost? I always say, how much does it cost to put a little sign up outside your restaurant or hotel saying, service dog toileting area? Somewhere, how much does it cost to put a water bowl down for a service dog? It's a matter of $2 or $3 or a sign. How much does it cost to produce large print black and white menus in restaurants? 10 cents? And how many people would that benefit? That wouldn't just benefit people who have their vision loss. It would also benefit people who are over 50, 55, who can't read fancy design menus in poorly lit restaurants. So, and again, this is a 10-cent cost. This is not a $200,000 renovation to put in an accessible toilet or a $50,000 renovation to put in a wider doorway and a ramp.
Of course.
This is a 10-cent thing that's going to help a lot of people. A sign to say dog toileting area is going to benefit a lot of people, and it's going to cost you $3 or $4.
Right.
To have bed raisers, little blocks that go under beds, under the bed, the legs of a bed, or under the tables in a restaurant, cost you $10. and it's going to benefit a lot of people who might not be using a wheelchair. So, you know, once you get past this idea of people in disability are in wheelchairs, then you open up a world of possibilities to help a large population at very small cost. But we have to shift this perception of disability equating wheelchair users.
Yeah.
And there we have this, you know, the international symbol for disability really has not served the disability communities very well at all, I think.
Right. No, I agree. How do we do it? I mean, you know, how do we get there? Well, what needs to happen for that shift from, you know, from accessibility to inclusiveness? What needs to happen? Do we need to have a new ADA? You know, I no complain about the ADA, 30 years and it achieved a lot, but it also, you know, it kind of froze us in time right now, at least in the US, in terms of understanding what it means.
I think things like the ADA, or here the DDA, or in the UK also the DDA, the legislation is really important. It's really, really important because it's something to fall back on. There's a minimum standard. There are minimum standards. Building codes, really important, because you see in countries where the building codes are not strictly enforced, the accessibility is greatly diminished, and where we have these disability discrimination acts in place, and we have building codes in place that are enforced to a large degree at least, then there is greater accessibility. There is, I mean, the US has benefited massively from having ADA. The ADA is now providing opportunities to make the digital world, to the digital space, more accessible, because there's been this massive surge in litigation against companies for not having accessible websites. And again, it's not people in wheelchairs who have mobility impairments, it's people generally who are blind or who have vision impairment who can't use websites. And they're taking people like Domino's to court and winning, and going to Supreme Court and winning, because, and Target and other even well-known and well-loved brands are being taken to court. And that's fair enough, because there is no excuse. There is no excuse for having an inaccessible website. And again, it goes back to the bottom line. Why would you deny access to your service and products through in an increasingly digital age by having an inaccessible website? That's absolute. It's self-defeating. It's nonsense. So I'm very proud of the content that I produced for the accessible travel market for Lonely Planet. Accessible travel online resources and the accessible travel phrasebook we've mentioned. Great resources in terms of accessible travel. It was great that I produced some destination guides to certain destinations, and I was ready to publish the destination guide to Tokyo to follow up on the one I did for Rio. That was already written, and all we were going to do was to put it into print, but unfortunately that didn't come to pass. But what I was very proud of at Lonely Planet was, for years I advocated for making our mainstream content accessible. It's very important to produce accessible travel content, but I think it's equally important to make sure your mainstream content is accessible. So I advocated for years with the developers at Lonely Planet to try and make our website more accessible. As we were saying, there's been this massive uptick in litigation against companies that have inaccessible websites. So I was very proud and very pleased last year when Lonely Planet introduced a widget to make the content on Lonely Planet more accessible to people with disabilities, particularly people using screen readers. And there's no excuse now. There are a couple of companies, I think one is called Accessibility, and there are a few others, where you can just install a widget, and that will actually make your website more accessible without the hundreds of developer hours retrofitting the website. So it may not be 100% ideal in terms of functionality, but it goes 95% of the way there, and I think that's pretty good. So I was very, very happy to make the When Lonely Planet, on my suggestion, install this widget to make their content, their mainstream content, accessible to all.
Sure, sure. No, that sounds great. You know, still on subject of how to make sure that the whole world understands those concepts and ready to move forward with that. So, you know, you talked about legal actions. That's a very touchy subject here in the U.S. Now, in the U.S., we are legal action trigger happy, and we hear a lot of pushback on that. Conferences and talks, and the more we talk about it, the more we sit down with people in the tourism industry or other industries, again, trying to bring them on board and understanding the value of inclusiveness, of course. The media, you know, I recently saw a movie on US Netflix. I'm not sure if it's already on Australian Netflix. It's a documentary on the Olympics, the Paralympics. It's called Rising Phoenix.
Rising Phoenix, I've heard about that.
Yeah. If you have a chance to watch it, absolutely. You know, I can't say enough good things about this documentary. It was funny, it was interesting, and I said to myself, you know, I'm watching that because I love sports, I love that. You know, it's all part of my world. But I'm very, very curious to see if the whole world is going to look at this movie, because it's such a great way of bringing home to the people that don't understand anything about our community. It's just a great way to introduce what we do, who we are, and so forth, and for them to understand the basic principles and the basic ideas, the basic concepts of what is part of our world. So the media, you know, if I wish there were more Netflix-produced, high-quality movies and documentaries about those concepts of inclusiveness, of sustainability. I don't know.
I think it's important. I think you're right. I think it's important to have documentaries and to have equally important.
Yeah, I lost your voice for a second. Go ahead.
Sorry, I said I think it's really important to have documentaries and other ways in which to raise awareness of the difficulties faced and the obstacles faced by people in the disability communities. But I think it's equally important to improve representation of disability on screen. Mm-hmm. And that's not in any way directed representation. That's simply representation. Now there are a couple of organisations, both of them. I mean, there's a couple in New Zealand and Australia, Attitude Foundation, which aim to increase the visibility of disability on screen. And this is not people doing amazing things. This is just normal, everyday people. If 20% of the population in any given country or around the world has a disability, then why wouldn't 20% of people on screen not have a disability?
Of course.
Of some sort. And it needn't be, you know, it needn't be a feature of, it needn't be made a feature of. It's just, this is what people live with. It's just a normal part of their life.
Of course.
And there are a few programs that do integrate people with disabilities into the storyline without making a big deal about their disability. You think about one of the big ones, of course, that was one of the most popular ones has been Breaking Bad, for example, where the son has a disability.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's not a core part of the story, and it's not made a big deal of. It's just that's just life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there's another one. I think it's Silent Witness in the UK, where there's one of the characters is in a wheelchair, and she's in a wheelchair. It's never mentioned that she's in a wheelchair, or it's not a big deal. She's just in a wheelchair. When you think about even the newer Mad Max, where the heroine had a disability. She had only one. It was never mentioned in the film. It was never mentioned. She just happened to have only one arm.
You know, it's I'm smiling because one of the very first television shows I've seen as a kid, and I fell in love with a show right away, black and white TV back in the 60s, Ironside. I don't know if you remember.
Ironside. Yep, I
It was
remember that.
it was a great show. I still love it. And again, to the point of Raymond Burr, I think that was the name of
Yep, Raymond
director,
Burr.
in a wheelchair. And again, it had the fact he was moving around in a wheelchair in the courthouse had nothing to do with the essence of the show and his intellect. Maybe that's why I'm doing what I do today, because in the back, this is something that came from, when I was a kid, I was already looking at that.
Yeah, that was incredibly avant-garde.
It was. So yeah, I mean,
except Raymond Burr was almost certainly not disabled.
No, he wasn't. That's true. Actually, yeah. No, of course. No, let's not equate that to blackface. But you're right. I mean, maybe at the time,
Which is another issue, of course.
No, well, maybe at the time Hollywood was not ready yet, air quotation mark, to actually have a person in a wheelchair being on the screen.
Hollywood is still not ready. I mean, sadly, many of the Oscars that have been given, all of the Oscars that have been given to disabled characters have been portrayed by non-disabled characters, starting with Daniel Day-Lewis, My Left Foot, and there is a problem with that. I mean, these were fantastic performances, but it's about time, in 2020, where people who are portrayed as having a disability on screen, actually, there's no reason why they shouldn't be actors with disabilities.
Of course. The phrase I like to use now, and I apologize if I sound arrogant, but it's, often I say, we are part of the mainstream, but actually the right phrase is we are the mainstream, not just part of it. We are the mainstream.
Yeah.
And if I succeed in having the people I have interact with, hotels, hospitality, transportation, you name it. If I can use that as to replace all those preconceived ideas about accessibility, disability, if I can just implant that idea that we are the mainstream, and that's the way you should be looking at us, then maybe there is a chance to achieve something.
Yeah. We're not going away. People with disabilities are not going away. We are already approximately 20% of the world's population, probably even more so in some countries. And sadly, many of those countries are developing countries where the infrastructure is already difficult for people who are able-bodied, let alone people with disabilities, which is why, sadly, in many developing countries, you don't see disabled people, because they simply can't get out of the house. And it's a very, very sad fact. And when I was in India, I noticed that, it's very, very challenging for people with disabilities. And so, you don't see many people with disabilities, even though there are obviously many, many millions.
Of course.
And I know when I was in India, and I was zooming around on my power chair, I was an object of great interest to people. And people would crowd around. They would even want to take selfies with me in my wheelchair. And they would ask me, how much does it cost? How much does your wheelchair cost? Because they'd never seen one like this before. And sadly, I'd have to say, look, it's really expensive. It's probably more than most of those people would earn in a year with the cost of my wheelchair. So it's very tough for a lot of the world. We're very, very fortunate in the developed world. How many accommodations are made for us, and how we have access to all this technology and all this equipment that most of the world doesn't. Sure.
Martin, I'm looking at my clock here. Already took more time than I promised that I would take from you. I could keep on talking with you for hours and hours, but I don't want to take too much of your time this morning. I'll let you have the last words and maybe just finish with your thoughts about everything that we talked, and maybe some words of hope for the future in front of us. And we can certainly reconnect at, in a couple of weeks or so and continue the conversation. So the floor is yours.
I'd just like to circle back to what we were talking about earlier on about sustainability, and how to maybe use this COVID to have a bit of a reset. Mm-hmm. Now, another one of my favorite themes when I'm talking at conferences and the like is actually talking about sustainability, and looking at how the incidence of disability increases with age. So, when people retire, maybe 40% of people retire with some sort of acquired disability. Yeah. When they reach 70 years old, it's 60%. When they reach 80 years old, it's 80%. And we have an aging demographic in the world. That's particularly in the developing world, very much an aging demographic. It's something that, Japan has been struggling with or thinking about since the 90s, because they have such a long-lived age population. But when you think about the sustainability of the tourism industry, as the world, as demographics change happens and the average age of people gets older, then if you want your tourism business to survive into the next 10, 20, 30 years, then you will necessarily have to take into account the Asian demographic and the greater incidence of disability as people grow older. And the fact that the baby boomers, and I was born in '62, which was the end of the baby boomers, which is also therefore the height of the baby boomers in terms of the numbers, because of population expansion. The baby boomers are controlling an increasing share of the world's financial resources, and also they're enjoying retirement for longer, and they're basically traveling more and more. I mean, I know so many people, retirees, who take 1, 2, 3, 4 trips, overseas trips a year. And all these people are increasingly having access requirements. So if you want sustainability in the tourism industry, then you will necessarily have to cater to this aging demographic. So this is where accessibility and sustainability intersect. So my advice to tourism businesses: look to demographics. If you're looking at sustainability into the long-term future, the 10, 20-year future, then you will have to address accessibility issues.
Absolutely, absolutely. Martin, thank you so much. I really enjoy talking to you. It's always a pleasure to see you, always a pleasure to talk to you.
And it's great to reconnect, Laurent.
And maybe with your permission, I will indulge myself of connecting with you again, maybe a couple of weeks in a month. I mean, we're all hoping for some miracle cure to come and, being able to travel again. So let's see if that happens. But I would love to reconnect and pursue this session with you again.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Martin. It was a pleasure.